Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. With me today, I'm excited to introduce a true freedom fighter, my colleague, the one and only Dr. Tom Lindsay. Thank you for joining me on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Lindsay, before we dive into the subject matter, today we're going to talk about an Article 5 Convention of States. But before we do that, I want to take a moment to just learn more about you and maybe things the public doesn't know about you. You're a constitutional scholar. You're in the higher education space. Tell us more about that background and how you came to, get what motivated you to join the higher education space.
Yeah, well, as you say here, I'm in higher education all my life. I've been teaching in universities since the 80s. I was a dean and then a provost and then a president of a university. And that combined with my experience from 2005 through 2009, I was the deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities under President George W. Bush. And that gave me a national picture of the state of higher education. And it's not a pretty picture. And so I tried to reform a single university, but I've learned that universities are pretty much unreformable from within. And so I decided instead to try to change higher education in a whole state, which is what I do now, working for TPPF.
And we're grateful for that. So let's dive into the subject matter. Tell our audience what an Article 5 convention is and why it's so important at this moment in time.
Yeah, well, let me read it. It's not a long passage here from the Constitution. Article 5 states two things, and let me read the first one. It says that the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. Okay, that's the first way that the Constitution gives us of amending itself. The House and the Senate, 2/3 of the members of each, have to propose amendments, which then go to the states, and then it takes 3/4 of the states, which means 38 states today out of 50, to make it a constitutional amendment. It's a hard process. We've only had 27 in our whole history. Now, that was going to be it. That was going to be the means of ratifying new constitutional amendments. But then George Mason of Virginia stood up. Convention's almost over. This is how you get a university named after you, is by doing what George Mason did. He said, hey, guys, we are establishing a government here in which we are trying to protect the liberty of the citizens, not only from foreign invasion, but also from their own government. He said, this means of amending the Constitution, where Congress is in charge and proposes it, that ignores the fact that Congress itself could in time come to be the oppressor. So he said, why would 2/3 of both houses of the U.S. Congress put out amendments to limit their own overreach? He said the states need to take a role. So that's how we got the second method, and I'll read that now. It says, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention, not may, shall. In other words, it's not up to Congress. Shall call a convention for proposing amendments which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. So that's the only power Congress has if the states propose an amendments convention. And that is to say, okay, to get to your 3/4, you've got to do it either through your legislature is voting for it or a amendment ratification group that's picked by each state. Congress tells them how to do it, but that's the only power Congress has.
So I want to do something pretty interesting for our podcast here. I want to do a rapid fire session on gotcha questions. So questions that the opposition usually throws our way on an Article 5 Convention of States. And I want to go one by one and just give us kind of like the top line. What's the response to that opposition question?
I'll do that. But if I may, so that our audience knows what is actually being proposed
Sure.
through these amendments, let me go through Governor Abbott's. In 2016, Governor Abbott put forward a list of amendments that should go to a state convention. And the first amendment that he proposed was to prohibit Congress from regulating activity that occurs wholly within one state. This takes us all the way back to the New Deal. Wickard v. Filburn ruled that a farmer, even though all of his goods were within his own state, they said that that is under the control of Congress's power over interstate commerce. Well, why? Because the court decided, well, it touches interstate commerce, and therefore Congress has control over it. That was terrible overreach, a torturing of the Constitution. And that's why Governor Abbott put that as the First Amendment to rectify the situation. Other amendments call for a balanced budget. It bars administrative agencies and the unelected bureaucrats that staff them from making federal law as well as from preempting existing state law. So it's reining in the power of federal bureaucrats. It empowers 2/3 majority of the states to veto a U.S. Supreme Court decision, as well as to override a federal law or regulation. It requires of the Supreme Court that they get a 7-vote majority anytime they seek to invalidate a democratically enacted law. It limits the powers of the federal government to those expressly delegated in the Constitution. And then finally, it enables state officials to sue in federal court when federal officials overstep their bounds. So the big picture on this is a way of restoring the original Constitution through these amendments by overturning bad Supreme Court decisions, bad practices by administrators.
I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes, and I brought it with me. It's by one of my favorite economists. It's Milton Friedman, who said on an Article 5 convention, the one device that can effectively bypass the Washington bureaucracy. And he goes on to say, in my opinion, the only feasible way of stopping tax increases is via a constitutional limitation on government spending and government taxes. We must not kid ourselves into thinking we are going to remedy it by the easy way of electing the right people into office. That will not work.
That's right. And Friedman adds later, he says, it's not electing the right people. It's about so informing and energizing the American people that even the wrong politician does the right policy.
There you go. So how about we get into these rapid fire questions? So the first 6 come from John Birch Society, which has been a prevalent opposition to an Article 5 convention. So here's number 1. Why should we trust a convention of states when the 1787 Constitutional Convention itself was a runaway convention that ignored its mandate to revise the Articles of Confederation, potentially setting a precedent for modern delegates to rewrite the entire Constitution?
Yeah. First thing we have to dismiss here is the notion that our own Constitutional Convention was a runaway convention. Now, there's a big difference between the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and an amendments convention called by the states. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was what's called a plenipotentiary convention, meaning everything was open for debate, everything was open to become part of the Constitution. That's not what an amendments constitution is. That's limited by the calls and the subjects that the 34 states, or 2/3, that's 34 states, instruct their delegates to go and pursue. So that's the first point. And then the second point, that our Constitutional Convention was a runaway convention. Here's the reason they say that. The Continental Congress established the convention to, quote, revise the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were our first government. Very weak. The states' relation to each other was more like the relation of individual countries in, say, NATO, right? It was primarily for purposes of defense. It was more than that, but it was a weak government. So the Continental Congress had revised the Articles, but then it said, in order to render the government adequate to the needs of its people. So the instruction was the means is revise the articles. The end is make a government that's adequate for the people. But what happened at the convention was people like Madison said, this is a contradiction. We can't make government adequate by simply revising the articles. And since making government adequate was the end toward which revising the articles was the means is always inferior to the end. So Madison and others argued we have to scrap the articles if we're going to actually make a government that's adequate for the people, because there's a contradiction in the command that we got from the Continental Congress. That argument proved persuasive. And so therefore, they did more than simply revise the articles. Yes, they scrapped them. I would say this to those that regard our Constitutional Convention of 1787 as a runaway convention. In my view, the Constitution that the Convention of 1787 produced is the greatest governing document in the history of the world. If that was the product of a runaway convention, let's have another.
There you go. Let's move on to the next question. How can you guarantee that progressive or globalist delegates won't dominate the convention, proposing amendments that erode the Bill of Rights or cede U.S. sovereignty to international bodies like the United Nations?
Yeah, and this concern is addressed very easily when you look at the history of state conventions. Most people don't know we had 30 interstate conventions before 1787. If it hadn't been for Virginia and New York proposing an amendments convention to get a Bill of Rights, Congress may not have given it to them in 1791. Remember, it wasn't in the original Constitution. That happened because of the force that was being exerted by the states, especially in New York and Virginia, which were so big. The amendments convention process is state-driven. Those who are members of it are agents of the state legislature, subject to their instructions, and they are subject to recall if they act, as it's called, ultra vires, which means beyond their legal authority or power. Mm-hmm. So this concern that it will simply overwhelm the country and end up with some crazy agenda that then gets forced on us as the new Constitution ignores what is probably the most important rebuttal, which you're going to hear more than once, because a lot of the questions ignore this fact. It takes 3/4 of the states to pass anything. That's 38 states. That means it takes only 13 states to block any constitutional amendment. If there aren't 13 states left in the country that still believe in liberty and equality and limited government, then our experiment's over already.
I agree. Next question. Isn't the call for a convention just a ploy by establishment elites to open the Constitution to changes that could entrench federal power, especially since Congress, which you criticize, controls the convention's call and can manipulate its rules?
Yeah, there's concern here Congress is going to get behind closed doors. Article 5, as the audience heard me read it, explicitly bypasses Congress's discretion. It mandates, and I quote, Congress shall call a convention, not may, not will discuss it, shall, if the states call it. Now, it's never happened. We've never gotten 2/3 of the states. But let me make an important point here, because some people say, well, why even waste our time on this? We've never had one before. It's been in the Constitution from the beginning. If you look at the history of the state amendments movement, you don't have to win to win. In 1911, they were 1 or 2 states away from having 2/3 of the states call an amendments convention to propose direct election of the U.S. Senate. It used to be that the U.S. senators under the original Constitution were elected by their state legislatures. So the states were 1 or 2 away from being able to call an amendments convention in 1911. by 1912, the U.S. Senate said, oh my God, we can't let the states know what power they have under the Constitution. So they took it over and they proposed it. So you don't have to win, is my point with this. Right?
Excellent. Why risk a convention when the Constitution isn't the problem? Enforcement is. Can we just elect better officials or rely on nullification to curb federal overreach without opening Pandora's box?
I agree that the Constitution itself is not broken, but I would argue that federal officials' disregard for it necessitates structural change. And in that light, Governor Abbott's Texas plan, with the amendments that he's proposed, is not really so much a vision to alter the Constitution as it is a call to restore the rule of law to the one we already have. Right? Elections and Supreme Court nominations have failed to curb federal overreach, as we see with our growing national debt, as well as with unelected bureaucrats making national law for us. So I would say that those concerns are overstated, and that what the amendments process is trying to do is just simply trying to restore individual liberty for American citizens as promised under the original Constitution.
Excellent. What prevents a convention from proposing amendments that weaken the Second Amendment or other core protections, especially given the influence of well-funded progressive groups and state legislatures?
Yeah, and the answer to that, we go back to the math, right? Once, say the Amendments Convention is called, at that point, whatever a majority of the state delegations propose goes to the states. Doesn't take 2/3 anymore. It takes 2/3 to get the Amendments Convention. Whatever a majority of state delegations agree on at the Amendments Convention goes to the states. But again, then you're back needing 38. So they can, this worry here that they're going to get behind closed doors, I mean, they could come out saying we're banning Christmas, but you got to get 38 states to agree with it, meaning 13 states can block it all.
That's right. How can you dismiss the risk of a convention being influenced by a biased media or public opinion swayed by misinformation, leading to amendments that undermine constitutional principles?
Well, now and back at the time of the founding, the media always exercised an influence on this. That's not going to go away. But the important point is that the Article 5 process is insulated from media distortions, from misinformation, misinformation that's affected by the public because of the stages that you have to go through. In other words, this is not something that is just going to be made up out of whole cloth. As I mentioned earlier, and this is from the great work of Rob Natelson on this, we had 30 state conventions before 1787. We had in 1787 and 88, New York and Virginia proposing, which gave us the Bill of Rights. In 1861, you had the Washington Conference, which Civil War was already starting, so it couldn't exercise its effect. But they met to try to head off the coming Civil War. Even in a period that tense as just before the start of the Civil War, they were still able to put together an amendments convention. So I would say that you're always going to have to worry about media influence, corporate influence, all kinds of influences. But the process anticipates that. It's driven by the states themselves.
Absolutely. The next 8 questions come from kind of progressives who oppose an Article 5 convention.
Oh, can I make one more point?
Yeah, go for it.
I think something that's not noticed is that an Article 5 movement, if successful, I mean, if we actually got 34 states to propose something, right, 2/3, people don't appreciate the civic educational effect that would have on the American people, most of whom don't even know they have this. And I don't blame them. I blame our universities for abdicating their role in providing civic education. And by that, I simply mean this. The U.S. citizenship test, 10 questions, multiple choice. Good news is 90% of immigrants to this country pass it the first time. You only have to get 6 out of 10 right? Multiple choice. The bad news, only 19% of native-born Americans under the age of 45 can get 6 out of 10 right.
Wow.
Yeah. You can't defend what you don't understand. Right? Again, I don't blame American citizens. I blame our educational institutions. The Article 5 process would be that education. It would provide, because think of how diverse our country is. To get 34 states to agree on subjects to go for an amendments convention. Think of all the coalitions that would have to be formed in states, between states, in regions, between and among regions. It would be a wonderful experience.
I would say it'd be monumental to be alive for an Article 5 convention.
Agreed.
You know, much in the same way that I never thought I'd see the overturning of Roe v. Wade. When that, the Supreme Court made that decision, I said to myself, I didn't think I'd be alive to see this.
Likewise. Well, and I got to experience an amendments convention as a mock simulation. The Convention of States Project, which is headed up by Mark Meckler, in Colonial Williamsburg in the summer of 23, I was one of the Texas delegates to an amendments convention, a mock. And you know what? It works. There are rules, and you don't have to worry about a runaway convention.
Absolutely. So let's get to the next set of questions from the progressives.
Yes.
Number 1, isn't a call for a convention just a conservative power grab to dismantle federal protections like the Civil Rights Act or environmental regulations rolling back decades of progress for marginalized communities?
Yeah. Again, I think those questions don't look seriously at the content of the amendments that are being proposed. As I went through Governor Abbott's proposed constitutional amendments, they focus on restoring federalism, which means restoring the power of the states vis-a-vis the federal government, and limiting federal overreach. Nothing in the amendments is about dismantling civil rights or dismantling environmental protections. For example, the First Amendment proposed would prohibit Congress from regulating interstate commerce, meaning commerce that happens solely within the state. As I told you, Wickard v. Filburn threw that out. It was a bad Supreme Court decision. This would overturn that. So no progress that's been made for marginalized communities is the target of this. This is instead simply trying to restore the federal government to its sphere under the original Constitution.
How can you claim a convention won't be a runaway when there's no clear constitutional mechanism to limit its scope, potentially allowing delegates to propose amendments that gut the Bill of Rights or enshrine discrimination?
Yeah, my study of this, as I mentioned earlier, really refutes the runaway convention fear because there is a vast amount of historical and legal precedent showing that conventions are limited in scope to their state applications. They don't just get there and they can talk about anything and change anything. It's got to be the subjects that were called, right? And this isn't speculation. Supreme Court ruled on this back in 1831 in Smith versus Union Bank. And there the Supreme Court said very clearly, the Article 5 convention is a state-controlled process, and the delegates are bound by the state instructions. So again, I think that that fear really has no ground when you look at all the guidance that we have, historical and jurisprudential, on the conduct, the process, and the scope of an amendments convention.
Why should we trust state legislatures, many of which are gerrymandered and unrepresentative, to control a convention that could undermine federal programs like Social Security or Medicare, which millions rely upon?
Yeah, I tell you, state legislators are elected bodies, right? Don't they reflect democratic will? And aren't they better positioned than unelected federal bureaucrats to represent the interests of local people in their states. So I've never really understood that criticism. We talk about runaway. Runaway applies best to federal bureaucrats. State legislators have if they're reps, a 2-year, if they're senators, a 4-year in the states, a leash on them. They're much closer to public opinion and to what the people want than any unelected federal bureaucrat could ever hope to be. This is a people's movement, right? And we are a democracy. And these amendments are designed to restore our democracy.
Well said. Doesn't the push for amendments to override Supreme Court decisions or federal laws by 2/3 state majority threaten the judiciary's role in protecting minority rights against majoritarian tyranny?
Yeah, I would say it doesn't, because remember, it takes 2/3 of the states to overturn a Supreme Court decision. How hard is that? Well, it takes 2/3 of the states to propose an amendments convention. Have we ever had one? No. Right? So, I mean, that is a check that they have put in order to make sure that minority rights continue to be protected. Because if it takes 2/3, that means a minority of the states can block it. Just as a minority of the states, right, 13 can block any constitutional amendment. No, this is an effort to restore our constitutional checks and balances, not to undermine minority rights. And I would go further to say that when our checks and balances are not functioning properly, that's when minority rights are in danger.
Excellent. Isn't the reliance on historical conventions misleading, given that modern political dynamics with polarized media and dark money could lead to chaotic convention that destabilizes the economy and emboldens adversaries?
Yeah. We had a polarized media at the time of the founding. Mm-hmm. And in fact, but back then they were honest. You had the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans at that time. And they were very clear, right? This is a Federalist newspaper, right? So everybody knew what they were about. There was no pretense to we're just telling the news here, right? So the notion that a biased media is going to disrupt this is contradicted by our own historical observation, right? And moreover, the historical conventions that the Article 5 processes are structured around and the state control on the basis of which they operate, that's the opposite of chaos. So the chaos that is feared here is, again, I think, without grounds.
How can you justify a convention when it could exacerbate inequality by empowering conservative states to push amendments that weaken federal authority to address climate change or labor protections?
Yeah, and this is a common concern of the left about an amendments convention. But if you look at the amendments, what do? They aim to restore constitutional balance, not to preclude federal action on climate change or labor protections within its enumerated powers. And we see that when you limit federal regulation to simply interstate activities, which is what the first amendment that Governor Abbott proposed does, that then allows states to innovate on local issues, such as we've seen in state-led environmental initiatives. And this is the notion that's called the 50 laboratories of democracy. And that's this: top-down solutions from federal government far away from local concerns don't always work, as we know. And all the polling, of course, shows that. The 50 little laboratories of democracy model can, through either their success or their failures, educate the other states. Right? They say, oh, look, this works in California, or this doesn't work in California. This works in Texas. It's a way of keeping states vibrant and innovative. They can't innovate if they're controlled by federal bureaucrats far away in D.C.
Why ignore the risk that a convention could be captured by corporate interests or wealthy donors, leading to amendments that prioritize profit or public welfare, like limiting federal regulatory power?
The delegates to the convention aren't chosen by private interests or by corporations or by the media. They're chosen by the state legislatures, right? And moreover, it's a state-driven process. So you can have all of these other countervailing forces in the air all around us. The process itself has been developed from going back before our founding to insulate it so that the process ensures that democratic will prevails.
Isn't the narrative about federal overreach just a dog whistle for states, historically used to justify segregation or other discriminatory practices, risking return to such policies?
Yeah, and for our audience here, states' rights, you hear that term. It was something used by the South as a defense of slavery. And because slavery is an absolutely evil institution, people are loath to use the expression states' rights anymore. In reality, under the Constitution, states don't have rights. If you look at the Constitution, when states are mentioned, states have powers. Individuals have rights. And that's a big difference. So this is not a revival of a discriminatory states' rights argument. It's instead simply trying to restore the balance between the federal government and state governments that existed at the time that the Constitution was ratified, because the balance has shifted away. And in shifting away, it's the people and their rights who have suffered, because it's only people who have rights.
Excellent. So right now, and that's the conclusion of our gotcha questions, if you will. Right now, as we sit here, HJR 98 by Representative Vasud is making its way through the Texas legislature, which would reapply that to a convention of states for the state of Texas. To wrap up here, what would be your elevator pitch to the Texas legislature on why Texas needs to reapply and extend this convention of states resolution?
Well, a supermajority of Texas legislators, just like a supermajority of the American people polled, are very frightened of federal overreach, very worried that individual liberty is come to be sacrificed at the altar of Washington, D.C. power. The only way to restore this legally is through the amendments process. Our founding fathers recognized that someday we would have this problem. That's why they gave us the Amendments Convention in Article 5. So if you're concerned about individual liberty, if you're concerned about federal overreach, if you want to make sure that your children and grandchildren have the same promise of the American dream than you had, then you have to reapprove this joint resolution. And then my hope is that 34 states will get this thing done, and we'll have that amendments convention. As the late Justice Antonin Scalia said back in 1979, he said, I don't really care what the First Amendment that comes out of this is. Now, he meant that a little flippantly, but he said, if you get 2/3 of the states to agree on anything and call an amendments convention, he said, you watch the Supreme Court justices and the Congress and the administrative branch stand up and take notice. It'll be a retaking back of our country in the name of the people for which it was established. And so for that reason, I would urge them to renew this call.
Dr. Lindsay, well put. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for joining me on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me.